Hello, welcome to a new tutorial presented by the SchrDbb. This tutorial, we are going to study the bones of the head. So, in order for us to study the bones of the head, we need to open up the different sutures which are found in the head. And we need to remove the connective tissues found. So, we're going to only study the bones and not the connective tissues. So all connective tissues are out. Now let's open up. So we are going to have, these are the different bones which are found inside the head. Starting with, we have the first bone here is the frontal bone. We need to first know that there are 21 bones in the head, and there are 14 bones which are fascial bones and 8 bones which are neurocranial bones, or bones of the cranium. So we have 14 fascial bones and 8 cranial bones. So let's start listing them. The cranial bones will consist of, number 1, the frontal bone. We have the 2 parietal bones, this parietal bone, this other parietal bone. We have the occipital bone. We have the temporal bone on each side. These are the different bones which are involved in the formation of the cranium. And we also have the sphenoid bone here. Now going up to the fascial bones, we have these 2 bones here are the maxillae. Here down is the mandible. Here is the zygomatic bone. Here's the zygomatic bone. Now here is the sphenoid. We have already counted it as one of the bone in the neurocranium. Now you need to know that there is a bone here anterior to the sphenoid, which can be counted, so at times to be fascial bone or at times to be a cranial bone, and that bone is the ethmoid bone. It can be seen here with the Crista Galli above. Now after the ethmoid bone, we can also see some minute bones here. We have one bone here, it's called the Vomer, and mainly function in the formation of the septum, in the nasal septum. Now after the Vomer here, we have these 2 small bones here in the nasal cavity, and they are called the inferior nasal conchae. These 2 small bones here, they are the inferior nasal conchae. After the study of those bones, we have the next bone here is a palatine bone. Here, this bone here is a palatine bone, and this lateral one is a palatine bone. So these are the different bones which are involved in the formation of the skull. Now, after having those bones, the next thing we are going to pass on to will be the study of the surface of the skull. Now let's have an anterior view to the skull. The anterior view to the skull, we have this bone here, the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone in the anterior view of the skull. Now these small, there are some population which have this small suture here, and this suture here is called the metopic suture. So at times some people have this suture which divides the frontal bone and can be confused with a fracture of the frontal bone, but some population don't have it. The next thing is the suture between the frontal bone and the maxillary bone. In order for you to give a name for a suture, it's just easy. Just call the first one of the bones, and then you call the next bone aside to it. So we can say that this suture is a maxillofrontal suture. Now here we have forgotten to call the nasal bone, and nasal bone is one of the fascial bone here. So this is the nasal bone here, and the nasal bone lie on the maxillary bone, as we can see on the lateral view. But now we are on the anterior view. So on anterior view, we can see here the nasion. The nasion is a point at which the different sutures are going to combine. Here is going to be the glabella. Here we can see the superciliary arc. We have the superciliary arc here. Now here we have the supraorbital. Here it will not be a foramen, but it will be a groove. So at times the supraorbital can exist as either a notch or a foramen, but this time around it will exist as a notch because it's not closed. So this is the supraorbital notch. After having the supraorbital notch, you need to know that if there exists a supra one, they will definitely exist an infra one, and this one here is a infraorbital notch. Now, after having the infraorbital notch, we are going to pass still on the anterior view. We can see the maxilla here. So this portion, we have the maxilla. Here the nasal bones. Here we can also see the zygomatic bones. We can see now the mandible here. At this portion of the mandible, which contain the dentition, we have the alveolar process. So this portion of the maxilla will be the alveolar process, and this portion of the mandible will be the alveolar process. Now again, the next point to note is that when you have, at any point you have a suture, you need to know that at any point that you have a suture, the bones have a process where they connect with another bone. So, and that process will have the name of the connecting bone. So let's see an example. We know that this portion here is a suture which connects the maxilla and the zygomatic bone. So we realize that what, since this is a portion of the maxilla which connects to the zygomatic bone, we are going to call it the zygomatic process of the maxillary bone. So it is the maxillary bone, but this portion of the maxillary bone will be called the zygomatic process because it's connecting to the zygomatic bone. And now this same portion of the zygomatic bone, it will be called the maxillary process of the zygomatic bone. So we already have some portions of the different bones that we need to place in our mind. Again, at this portion here where the frontal bone and the maxillary bone are connected, you can call it the frontal on the portion of the maxillary bone, you can call it the frontal process of the maxillary bone, and the portion of the frontal bone, you can call it the maxillary process of the frontal bone. Now we have already visualized the anterior view of the head. Now let's visualize the lateral view. On the lateral view, we can find now, here was the body of the mandible, here is the mental foramen. We can find at this section, and we need to know that there is at times, most of the times, there is another foramen here, which is the zygomatico-fascial foramen, but here it cannot be seen. And here is a piriform aperture with the two anterior nerves. On the lateral view, we can see the ramus of the mandible. This time around we have a ramus of the mandible, and the ramus of the mandible divides anteriorly to give a coronal process and posteriorly to give the condyle of the mandible. And the condyle consists of the head of the mandible and the neck of the mandible. So you see that at this portion there is a small joint, and the joint can easily be called, because you have this bone here. This bone here is a temporal bone, and this bone here is a mandibular bone. So the joint will be called the temporomandibular joint. Connects the temporal bone and mandibular bone. Now later on, you have the sphenoid bone here. This portion of the sphenoid bone is going to be the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Here is a frontal bone, the squamous process of frontal bone. Here is the squamous process of the parietal bone. So on the lateral view, you can see that here is a mastoid process of the temporal bone. Here you see that at this portion it's connecting with the zygomatic bone, so it's going to be called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and here is going to be called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Here it is going to be called the frontal process of the zygomatic bone at this portion here, because connecting to the frontal bone. Now you have seen the lateral section, and on the lateral section you can also see some sutures. This suture is going to be called the coronal suture we can have a similarity with the coronal plane. We know that the coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior view. So this is a coronal suture because it's dividing directly across the frontal bone and the parietal bone, and making that the head should be divided into an anterior and posterior section. At this portion here, we have we know that it's a sphenoid bone, and here is the frontal bone. So this portion, I said initially that in order for you to call a suture, you can give the name of the different bones which are bounding the suture. Now this suture here is going to be called the Spheno-Frontal Suture or the Fronto-Sphenoid Suture, but it's better to say Spheno-Frontal Suture. At this portion here, you're going to call it, because connecting the sphenoid and the parietal bone, you're going to call it the Sphenoparietal Suture. And at this portion here, you're going to say the Sphenosquamous Suture. Now, it's not going to be just the Sphenotemporal Suture here, because the temporal bone is a very vast and complicated bone. It consists of many portions. You have the squamous portion of the temporal bone, you have the mastoid portion of the temporal bone, and you have the tympanic portion of the temporal bone with the styloid process there. Now, we need to know that since it's very vast as such, so there is going to be a division, and if you want to call this suture, not just say the sphenotemporal suture, but you are going to say the sphenoSquamous with a particular part of the temporal bone. So say the sphenoSquamous suture. At this portion here, it connects the squamous part of the parietal bone with the squamous part of the temporal bone. We can still call it the parietosquamous suture, but since it connects the squamous part of parietal bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone, we can just give it an easy name of squamous suture. Now here you can see that it connects the occipital bone here with the temporal bone here. So the suture here is going to be called the occipital temporal suture. Normally it's going to be called occipital temporal suture, but as I rightly said, the temporal bone has many parts. I think 4 parts. So we need to give the specific part that it is connecting. So we see that this part is the mastoid part of the temporal bone, and this part is occipital bone. So we're going to call it instead the occipital mastoid suture. Now, going down to the posterior view of the head, we are going to see that we can see the 2 parietal bones, we see the occipital bone, we see the temporal bone here. Now, this suture here is going to be called the sagittal suture, and this is similar to the sagittal plane. With the sagittal plane, we know that the sagittal plane divides the body into the left and right side. So the sagittal suture here, we can see that it similarly divides the skull into the left and right side. Now here you have the Lambdoid Suture. Here we need to know that there is a point here called the lambda with respect to the Lambdoid Suture. This Lambdoid Suture is separating the occipital bone from parietal bone. We have this point here is called the lambda at intersection between sagittal and the Lambdoid Suture. Now at the intersection between the Lambdoid Suture, the occipital mastoid suture, and the squamous suture, here you have the asterion, that point. Now, seeing on the posterior view of the skull, we can realize that the occipital bone has some features. Here you can see the superior nuchal line, here you can see the inferior nuchal line, and here you can see the external occipital crest. Now, this is external occipital crest. The external occipital crest is a line which joins both of nuchal line. We have the superior and inferior one. You see that there's a line that joins the two, and this is the external occipital crest. Now, we need to realize that this point here, this particular point which is coming out from the superior nuchal line, this point which is bordering at the external occipital crest is connecting the lines together. Now you need to know that these points now which come out from the superior nuchal line is this particular point come out from the superior nuchal line is the external occipital protuberance. Now it's now instead the protuberance. The crest is a line which moves all through the different nuchal lines, and the protuberance is a one which points out directly from the superior nuchal line. And internally you can have the same feature. So this is what we can see from the posterior view of the head. Now let's see the superior view of the head. Visualizing superiorly, you can see the frontal bone here. You have the parietal bone, and these 2 points here, these 2 points are going to be the parietal foramen. This is sagittal suture, the coronal suture, the 2 parietal bone, and you have the parietal foramen. The parietal foramen are used to connect with the emissary veins, and this emissary vein connect with the venous drainage of the brain with the venous drainage of the superficial portion. And this is of clinical relevance because if you have an infection of the scalp, it can migrate to the venous drainage of the brain, and it can cause you meningitis. This can be a clinical importance. So somebody who has a lesion of the scalp should be taken very serious, because upon long run can cause infection to the meninges. So now we have seen the different views of the skull. We can now pass to visualizing. We can now go to the study of the main bones of the head. So now let's start with the frontal bone. So frontal bone, see the parts of the frontal bone. So now this is the frontal bone here. The frontal bone here, you can see the squamous process here. Now you have the squamous process of frontal bone. At this portion here is going to be the portion which is found inside the cranial fossa. So the name of this portion is going to be called the orbital plate or the lamina orbitalis. Now the next portion we can see inferior here is the orbital plate still. So you can realize that still the orbital plate. At this portion here above, we have the portion called the nasal process. Because it's called the nasal process because we realize that at this portion it connects with the nasal bone, and inferiorly here it can be called the maxillary process because laterally it connects with the maxillary bone. So this is briefly the study of the temporal bone here. You can have the zygomatic process at this portion here. The zygomatic portion at this portion here, all around here is the squamous part, and with posterior portion here. Here is a portion which is going to connect with the parietal bone, so it's going to be coronal suture. Now we are going to move to the next study, the next bone. So taking the next bone, we have the frontal bone. Now taking the next bone of the cranium, we have the parietal bone. Parietal bone, there is nothing to study much there, except that we need to know that the parietal bone connects the different sutures and that the parietal bone is squamous. Now after studying the parietal bone, we can take now the temporal bone and go to its study. So temporal bone, we have the different parts. So let's take the temporal bone. Now the temporal bone here, we see that the temporal bone is a much more complex bone. So at this portion here, we have the squamous part of the temporal bone. So this portion here is going to be called the squamous part of the temporal bone. Squamous parts of temporal bone. Again, after having the squamous part of the temporal bone, need to know that this portion here is going to be called the mastoid part of the temporal bone. And since the mastoid part of the temporal bone, you realize that there's a small foramen here, and this foramen is going to be called the mastoid foramen. Now here you see that this portion which has much of the ridges, of the temporal bone, you need to note again that the squamous part of temporal bone is a part which is very smooth. Now in contrary, the mastoid part is the part which has this mastoid process. It's characterized by the mastoid process here. The tympanic part is the part which is characterized as containing the internal ear. Now you need to know that this portion here, which is having much of the ridges of the temporal bone, is going to be called the temporal, the petrous part of the temporal bone. As you can see here, petrous part of temporal bone. Now the petrous part of the temporal bone has many foramina, as we can see. We have this foramina here, and this foramina is the internal acoustic meatus. The internal acoustic meatus is a portion which is going to relay the external ear, because you have the external acoustic meatus here. The external acoustic meatus is a portion at the interior part of your ear So when you place your hand directly inside the ear, as the ear the sounds of the sounds in the surrounding are transferred through the ear canal, is going to enter in the external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus is lined by the tympanic membrane. It's going to transfer the sound now through the tympanic part of the temporal bone, and it's going to enter the internal ear, that the internal acoustic. So, and then it's going to enter the internal ears found at this portion here, at this distance between the external acoustic meatus and internal acoustic meatus. Now the internal acoustic meatus is going to transfer the nerves which are involved in the acoustic or hearing. Now the nerve which is in the cranial nerve which is involved in hearing is a vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to pass, or the auditory nerve is going to pass in the internal acoustic meatus. Also, you need to know that the fascial nerve also passes in the external acoustic meatus, because the fascial nerve gives some branches of the sensory location of sensory part to the ear, and also the fascial nerve also give another branch to the muscle called stapedius, in order to reduce the frequency of sound which enters the ear. Now the next portion we need to know again is this other foramina here. So this foramina is a jugular foramen, and the jugular foramen is not only based on the temporal bone. It's going to be formed as a result of the boundaries between the temporal bone and the occipital bone, as we're going to see in the cranial fossa. Now after having this, you have the last one, the carotid canal here. So the carotid canal is going to take the internal carotid artery from here and put it out here. So we have the petrous part, which contain most of the different foramina. After the petrous part, we have the tympanic part here. So this is the tympanic part of the temporal bone, which contains the different portion of the ear. And on the tympanic part of the temporal bone, we realize that this is a small process which is moving out here, and this process is called the styloid process. So now let's pass to the next portion of the bones. We have the temporal bones, which have already been studied. After the temporal bone, we can now go the nasal bone. There's nothing to study. You just know that the nasal bone lies on the maxillary bone. Now after the study of nasal bone, you can then go to another complex bone, the maxillary bone. We go to the part of the maxillary bone, have different parts. The maxillary bone is seen as such. This portion here, which connects with the zygomatic process, is going to be called the zygomatic part of the maxillary bone. Now this portion is going to be called the frontal process of the maxillary bone, because it contains the frontal bone. Now this is going to be the orbital plate of the maxillary bone, because it's a portion which is connecting with the orbital part of the eye. Now here will be the body of the maxillary bone, and here is the inferior orbital, as you can see here, the infraorbital foramen, or the inferior orbital foramen, as you can see here. Here is the suture at the point of the intermaxillary suture, because you need to know that there are two maxillary bones, and inferiorly here, which is connected to the dentition, is going to be called the alveolar process. So this is the different portion. Here is going to be the nasal portion of the maxillary bone, still connecting with the body. So now, and this to the nasal portion, you see that there are these ridges for connection, and it's going to connect with the ethmoid bone here. So this is the study of maxillary bone. Now after studying the maxillary bone, we pass to the next bone, the zygomatic bone. There's nothing to study mostly on it. We can pass to the next bone, to the mandible. Now the mandible is this bone. You see that it's consisting mainly of the body and the ramus. The ramus now divide into two portions. This anterior portion is called the coronal portion, and this posterior portion is called the condyloid, or the condylar process. The condylar process consists of the head and the neck. So these are the portion that you can see externally on the mandible, and these two foramina here are the mental foramen. Here is the body of the mandible, the ramus divided into two portions. Head, which is going to do an articulation with the temporal bone to form temporomandibular joint. Now internally, you can see different things on maxillary bone, though it hasn't been shown very well. There are very minor processes here, called the genial tubercle. Here they're supposed to be two very small, or the mental spines. You have the superior mental spine here and the inferior mental spine at this position. So now, after having this, you need to know that the line which passes from here to here is going to be called the myeloid line. There's supposed to be a myeloid line here. You can, if you visualize very well, you realize that this is small line as such here, and there's another small line as such here. So these are the myeloid line. So these are the myeloid lines. After having those myeloid lines, we need to know that we have this mandibular foramen here. We have the two mandibular foramens at these positions here. So we have the mandibular foramen, and the mandibular foramen is going to contain the last portion of the mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve is going to give this is going to give the alveolar part of this alveolar component, which is going to move from the up here, and then the mandibular nerve is going to pass up to it, and then it's going to give some alveolar portions which are going to supply to the dentition of the mouth. Now, after having the myeloid line, we also have this above here. You have the myeloid groove. Here you have the myeloid line. Here you have this. If you see very well, you have with very good precision, there's supposed to be a submandibular groove here, and here there's supposed to be a sublingual groove. So you need to know that above the myeloid line this is sublingual groove, and below it there's a submandibular groove. So these are different portions you guys can see from internal view of the mandible. Now, taking the next bone, we can now take the frontal bone, have already been dealt with. The next bone, which is complex in the head and neck, is the ethmoid and the sphenoid bone. So let's take the this bone here. We have forgotten to call this last bone the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is found here. It's another bone of the head. So the nasal bone and lacrimal bone should not be forgotten. And what lies on the lacrimal bone, you need to know that it's a lacrimal sinus and not a lacrimal gland. The lacrimal gland is located laterally, while the lacrimal sinus is located medially. So when you want to tear, before this lacrimal secretion which goes and being stored in the lacrimal sinus, and during tearing you realize that there's going to be the release of the lacrimal of tears from the lacrimal sinus now to the medial portion of the eye, or it can also be released at this portion of the nose here in the middle nasal meatus. So now let's go to the study of the next bone, the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone is another complex bone that you need to study. So now on the superior part of the ethmoid bone, we realize that you can see the two alleys of the ethmoid bone. You can see the Crista Galli here, and the Crista Galli is the portion is going to connect to with the falx cerebri, which is going to divide the two cerebral hemispheres. Now you can see this portion here. We have the cribriform plate, which has the cribriform foraminals. Now laterally here, we can see that there are some lateral plates of the ethmoid bone. Here is going to be the perpendicular plate which moves down here and is going to form part of the nasal septum. So now laterally again, we need to know that there exists what we call the ethmoidal air cells. So we have the anterior ethmoidal air cell, the medial ethmoidal air cells, and the posterior ethmoidal air cells, which are found here. So this is what we can see laterally. Now again, now medially, slightly medially, we are going to see that they are going to be the formation of here some bulges. We have the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha. The inferior nasal concha is a bone on itself. The superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha come from the ethmoid bone. So these are the different things that you can find on the ethmoid bone. Now going to the next portion, we have this sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is another complex bone you can see it looks like something, a bird or something like a bat. So you realize that it has a wing. If you visualize very well, a wing and legs down. What you can consider as a wing, you can see that the wing can be divided into two portions. Here is a lesser wing of the ethmoid bone. Here is a greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Here is the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. There is the greater wing of sphenoid bone. And realize that on the lesser wing there is a foramina here, and this foramina is called the optic canal. Here you can realize that between the lesser wing and greater wing there exists another fissure, another foramina, and this fissure is going to be called the superior orbital fissure. So here you have the superior orbital fissure. You need to know that this is not the superior orbital fissure, is not the supraorbital foramen or the supraorbital notch. Supraorbital notch was seen on the anterior view of the head. Near the superior orbital fissure is seen now inside the eye, as we're going to visualize the orbital cavity. Now, the next portion, you see that there's another foramen here, and these foramens here are going to be called the Foramen Rotundum. Here you have the Foramen Rotundum. Here you have the foramen. You have the next foramen here. You see the greater wing, and here you have the next foramen, the Foramen Ovale, at this portion here. You need to know that there's another foramen here which is connected with the temporal bone. So when it's going to do a junction with the temporal bone and the occipital bone, you're going to have another foramen here which is going to be called the Foramen Lastivum. Here is going to be the foramen spinosum, characterized by containing the middle meningeal artery here. So now this is the greater wing. Now this is when you see in the direction of the cranial fossa or the superior view. Now seeing this one is going to form the orbital part, the sphenofrontal is going to form the orbital part of the sphenoid. So it's the frontal process because it connects with the frontal bone. So it's Frontal Suture and all that. So now on the inferior view, or first on the frontal view, you first realize that you can see this different portion of the sphenoid. You have this downward portion. This main big portion of the sphenoid is called the Sphenoid Body. And now the Sphenoid Body will give some processes downward here. We have this one is going to be called the pterygoid plane, and the pterygoid plane is now going to divide into a medial portion and a lateral portion. This medial portion is going to be called the medial pterygoid plate, and this lateral portion is going to be called the lateral pterygoid plate. These are the different pterygoids which are going to be found here. So this is what you can see from this portion. And now if you visualize very well, you realize that you can see something else. This was the greater wing, and this is another foramina here. So we have the Foramen Rotundum. Now you see that the Foramen Rotundum is going to enter in the maxillary cavity, so that's why it's located in this particular direction. It's going to enter in the nasal cavity. So that's the peculiar characteristic of Foramen Rotundum. And what passes in the Foramen Rotundum is a maxillary nerve. So we are going to visualize it in the later sections. Now, so the next bone which has been studied, the sphenoid bone. So these are the main complex bones which have been studied in the head and neck. So after having the different study of the bones, of the main complex bone in the head and neck, we are going to pass now to the study of the different cavities and fossae of the head and neck. So point number one, we are going to study the orbital cavity. So visualizing the orbital cavity, you realize that when you want to study a particular cavity or region in the head, you realize you need to realize that in the first thing that you have to do in the study of that particular region is to give the boundaries. After giving the boundaries of that particular region, you need to give now the content of that region, and lastly, after giving the content of that region, you need to give the so these are the two main things and you can even give the different things which can cause through that region. So but the two main things are you have to give the boundaries of the region and you have to give the content of the region. But the content of the region will not be given now because you have not yet studied the different portion of the connective tissue, muscles, arterial supply and venous drainage of the head. So that is when only when you are going to have the different knowledge of the different portions of the head tutorial that you can give the content of particular regions. So we are just going to give the different boundaries in the region. Now, orbital cavity. What are the boundaries of orbital cavity? You see that medially we have, if you visualize internally, we have this bone here, and this bone here is going to be called the ethmoid bone. We have ethmoid bone medially which form the orbital cavity. We have again superiorly the frontal bone. Here posteriorly you have the greater wing. Here you have the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Here we have the zygomatic bone. Here we have the maxillary bone. Here we have the lacrimal bone. So these are different bones which form the orbital cavity. So the boundaries, we can just say medially ethmoid bone, maxillary bone, lacrimal bone, and medial part of the frontal bone. Laterally we have the greater the greater wing of the sphenoid. We have the zygomatic bone, and we have the lateral part of the frontal process of orbital part of the frontal bone. So this already the orbital cavity which has been visualized. Now again, you need to know that on the posterior part of orbital cavity, you see that there's a hole here. This hole is going to be the superior orbital fissure here. This hole which is going to pass here is going to be the superior orbital fissure. And now you need to know that there is another hole down here, which is between the hole is between the maxillary bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid. So a fissure, there's a difference between a fissure and a foramen. A foramen is a hole which is on only one bone, while a fissure is a hole which is found between two bones. It's a crack which is found between two bones. Here we see that the lesser wing and the greater wing, they are between the two parts of the sphenoid bone. So it's going to be called a fissure. It's a crack. And here is also a crack here. You see that it's also a crack here. And here is going to be called the inferior orbital fissure. Now this other portion here is going to be the foramen rotundum here. So these are the different things that you can see in the orbital cavity. Now after the orbital cavity, you can now pass to the nasal cavity. In the nasal cavity, you can visualize that we have the nasal septum, the medial portion. Laterally, you have the inferior nasal concha and the lateral wall of the ethmoid bone. On the inferior portion, we have the palate. We have the hard palate. The hard palate comprises anteriorly of the palatine process of the maxillary bone and posteriorly the horizontal plate of maxillary bone. So we need to know that the nasal septum is made up of different bones. Superiorly, the nasal septum is going to be made up of the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Inferiorly, this bone here is going to be the vomer, and it's going to do the posterior portion of the nasal septum. We have also a small spine which comes from the maxillary bone called the maxillary perpendicular plate, and also have a small perpendicular plate which comes from the palatine bone posteriorly. So this is what will make the medial portion of the nasal cavity, and the lateral portion we say that very superior, the middle nasal concha and inferior nasal concha. So this is what you can see on the nasal cavity. Now going to the fosses, so we have seen the different cavities of the eye of the head. We can now pass to the fossa of the head. So the three main fosses of the head, you have the temporal fossa, we have the infratemporal fossa, and we have the cranial fossa. So now the temporal fossa is just here. So all this all around here is going to be the temporal fossa. And now it's called a temporal fossa because it consists of the temporalis muscle. The temporalis muscle is all around here. So now what are the boundaries of temporal fossa? We can say that at the roof of the temporal fossa, the lateral section of the temporal fossa, you have the temporalis fascia, and you can see the temporalis fascia if we place the connective tissue. So let's see how we place the connective tissue. So now this is a connective tissue. When we place the connective tissue, you realize that you can see now the temporalis fascia, and that the temporalis fascia is what is going to be found at the roof of or the lateral part of the temporal fossa. Now on the medial part, you see that you can now call the squamous processes of the different bone. You have the squamous process of the parietal bone, you have the squamous process of the frontal bone, you have the greater bone of the sphenoid, and the squamous process of the temporal bone. So these are the different parts here. Now again, on the temporal bone, you need to know that on the superior aspect is going to be lined by this line here. If you realize very well, or you have this fascia is covered, is at this distinct line which cut this fascia, and this line here is going to be the superior temporal line. So you have the superior temporal line and you have the inferior temporal line here. So the superior temporal line is the superior line which bounds the temporal fossa, and you have the inferior temporal line here. Now at the inferior portion, we see that there's another line here which is going to bound the temporal fossa, and that line is going to be the zygomatic arc. The zygomatic arc consists of the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So this is zygomatic arc here. So these are the different boundaries of the temporal fossa. Now after having the different boundaries of the temporal fossa, we can now move to the next portion, which is the infratemporal fossa. So since you have already seen the temporal fossa, you know that what is going to be below the temporal fossa is going to be the infratemporal fossa. So let's see the infratemporal fossa. To visualize infratemporal fossa, we need to shade the maxillary bone, because the infratemporal fossa is found just beneath it. So we have the infratemporal fossa below. Now, what are the bounds of infratemporal fossa? You see that outwardly you are going to have the mandible. So on the lateral section, lateral part, you are going to have the mandible. Now the medial part, you realize that there's this small process here, and we've seen that it's coming. We can see that it's coming from the sphenoid bone. So this small process is coming from the sphenoid bone here, and this small process, we see that is a cause of the medial portion. So at the medial portion, you can see that is the lateral plate of the sphenoid bone, because lateral here, and this portion is lateral. You can see lateral and medial plate of the sphenoid bone at the medial portion of the infratemporal fossa. Now on the anterior portion of the infratemporal fossa, you can see some dentition. On the posterior portion, you're going to realize that on the inferior portion first, there's going to be a muscle which is going to line, as you are going to see in the lateral section. You cannot see in this view. So, and that muscle is going to be called the medial pterygoid muscle, which is going to line the inferior part of the infratemporal fossa. Now, anteriorly to the infratemporal fossa, you are going to have the pterygopalatine fossa here. So anteriorly to the infratemporal fossa, you are going to have a small fossa here, the pterygopalatine fossa, and that pterygopalatine fossa is the one which is going to contain the pterygopalatine ganglion and some other nerves of the maxillary division. So all that can go and pass into the nasal cavity. Realize that it can pass into the nasal cavity and to go into the alveolar processes of the mandible from the pterygopalatine fossa. So it's another fossa, but it's a very minute fossa in the skull. So now, after visualizing these different fosses, you can also have the tympanic cavity here. The tympanic cavity is only a small cavity which is correlated with the ear here, but it's not of very great importance in study of the head and neck anatomy. We can also note this as another cavity. Now, after visualizing all those, we will visualize the last portion, which is one of the main portion of the head and neck anatomy, anatomical region. So now let's visualize it. In order to visualize it, we need to cut the head. So we want to visualize the last fossa, which is going to be the cranial fossa. And to visualize the cranial fossa, you need to cut the head in this direction. So you're going to go to tools of complete anatomy, go to cut, In cut, we show the direction in which we want to cut. So I'll first start by cutting the occipital bone. After cutting the occipital bone, I'll cut this other bone here, the parietal bone. After cutting the parietal bone, you cut the other bone. So the frontal bone now. So this one can be cut. Cut the frontal bone. So this is what you are going to have when they are cut. So again, continue cutting here and superiorly. So now we have already cut the bone. Now we can visualize the bone superiorly. Now let's visualize the bone superiorly. You see that you can visualize now the cranial fossa. So when you cut the head superiorly, you visualize the cranial fossa internally as such. Now the cranial fossa, what is found inside the cranial fossa? You see that the cranial fossa generally can be divided into three parts. You have the anterior cranial fossa, you have the middle cranial fossa, and you have the posterior cranial fossa. Now the anterior cranial fossa, you have the different boundaries. Here you have the Crista Galli, here you have the squamous part of the frontal bone. The Crista Galli is that plate of the Ethmoid Bone with initially this is a cribriform plate of the Ethmoid Bone which initially seen in the Ethmoid Bone study. Superiorly here, you are going to have, at first at this point here, you're going to have the frontal crest, and you are going to have the Crista Galli. Both of them are going to merge. So the Crista Galli is this small line above here. You see that it's going up slightly above at this portion. So the Crista Galli. And at this portion here, you see that there's a small line that goes up from the frontal bone, and that's the frontal crest. Now you can see different points on this Crista Galli, and these are the foraminals of the Crista Galli. And if you visualize very well, at the junction between the frontal crest and Crista Galli, there's going to be a foramina here, and this foramina is going to be called the foramen secum. You have the foramen secum here, you have the anterior ethmoidal foramen here, you have the posterior ethmoidal foramen here, though they are not visible on this diagram. Now these are the different boundaries of the anterior. So anterior cranial fossa start at this portion, it goes as such, like this, in this direction, then it continues in this direction, continuing like that, and taking all through like this, and then moving. So this is the direction of the anterior cranial fossa. So now let's, as we initially said, we have to study the boundary of the anterior cranial fossa. So you will say that medially you have the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, you have the Crista Galli of the ethmoid bone, we have the you have the major portion of the squamous part of the temple of the frontal bone. Now laterally, what you have the squamous part of the frontal bone. Posteriorly, what we have, you have the lesser wing, so it goes as such and it continues here on the lesser wing. So you're going to have the lesser wing. Now you have again this, the lesser wing stop here and then continues as such. Posterior, you have the lesser wing, and laterally here we have again the squamous part of the frontal bone. So these are the different portions of the anterior cranial fossa. So now after having the anterior cranial fossa done, we are going to have the middle cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa goes from here in laterally, then pass here as such, then continue here, and then moves all around here. So at times there's a confusion on which cranial fossa contains the optic canal. This is the optic canal here. So at times there's a confusion which cranial fossa contains optic canal. But at times placed on the anterior cranial fossa, at times placed on middle cranial fossa. But what you need to know is that the optic canal is at the boundary of both. But most of the time it can be placed on the anterior cranial fossa, in the anterior cranial fossa. So that's what we can see on anterior cranial fossa. Here you have the optic canal, and the optic canal is going to contain the optic nerve. Just from the name, you can imagine the nerve it contains. And the only artery that optic canal is going to contain is the ophthalmic artery. no other or no other blood vessel is going to pass in the optic canal. It's only the ophthalmic artery, and the reason for that is that the ophthalmic artery need to pass with the optic nerve in order to supply the optic nerve for you to never to have a lesion if there is any ischemic damage on other blood vessels. So that's why there is a particular artery which goes through the optic canal and no other one. So after having the optic canal in mind, you need to know that this process posteriorly to the lesser ring is going to be called the anterior clinoid process, and this process here from the dorsum cell is going to be called the posterior clinoid process. Now you need to know that at this portion here there's a small groove, and this groove is a chiasmatic groove, because when the eye is going to, when you have the eye as such, you have the optic nerve which come out. The optic nerve is going to have the nasal. Their nasal, you have to know that their nasal vision, the nasal field or the temporal field of the optic nerve are going to pass and do a chiasm at this portion. The temporal field of the optic nerve is located at the nasal region of the eye. So you have to know that they have to do a chiasm at this portion, and if there's a lesion at this portion, you're going to have a bitemporal hemianopsia. Now continuing later, you have this portion here. It's called the sella tursissa, and the sella tursissa is divided into three portions. You have the tuberculum sellae, you have the hypophyseal fossa, it's descending, and posteriorly you have the dorsum sellae. So these are the three main portions: tuberculum sellae, hypophyseal fossa, dorsum sellae. So this is what you can see. Now next thing is, after having this, you need to know that the hypophyseal fossa contain the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. We also have the greater ring of the sphenoid. The greater ring of the sphenoid has at this portion a foramen here, and this foramen is going to be called the foramen. If you want to easily memorize the different foramen which are located in the middle cranial fossa, you just have to note the word, the mnemonic SchrOlin, SROLIN. So the first S is going to correspond with this foramina here, and this fissure here of foramina here is going to be called the superior orbital fissure here. Now after having this fissure, you need to know that you have this other one. So the S at the first S is going to be a superior orbital fissure. This one here is going to be R, and it's going to be called Foramen Rotundum. So this Foramen Rotundum, the next S, so we have SchrOlin. So the next letter is O, and this one here is going to be the Foramen Ovale. So O corresponds to Foramen Ovale. Lastly, you have this schos S. The next S which comes is going to correspond with the Foramen Spinosum, and the L which comes is going to correspond with the Foramen Lacerum here, or Foramen Lacerum at this portion. And lastly, we have IN. IN is going to correspond with the internal acoustic meatus, though the internal acoustic meatus is much more located in the posterior cranial cavity. So these are the boundaries. So when you have the different contents of the middle cranial fossa, the boundaries, you have anteriorly the lesser ring, laterally we can see the greater ring and the temporal squamous process. Posteriorly we have the petrous part of the temporal bone, and medially we have the sella tursissa. This is the boundary. Now on the posterior cranial fossa, the boundary will be petrous part of temporal bone laterally. Medially we have the basilar part of the occipital bone, and we have the internal occipital crest. We've seen that exteriorly we could see here the external occipital crest with the external occipital protuberance, but internally we can see instead the internal occipital crest with the internal occipital protuberance. All them, the internal occipital protuberance plus external occipital protuberance, they form the union. Now on the posterior cranial cavity you have this. So you have seen the boundaries. After having the boundaries, you can see this small this thin thin process here, and this process is going to be called the dens, coming from the axis. So we have here the foramen, the major foramen, which shows the posterior cranial fossa, is the foramen magnum, this major foramen. Here you are going to have the jugular foramen located on this side here, and here you are going to have the carotid canal located here. So you have the carotid canal located here, and it's going to give it branch up here to the foramen lacerum. Here you have the internal acoustic meatus. So the different foramen which are located in the posterior cranial fossa: internal acoustic meatus, jugular foramen, foramen magnum, and here you have the hypoglossal foramen. So we have seen all the different foramens which are located inside the cranial fossa. From here we can say that there's a conclusion. We have seen a conclusion on the head and neck anatomy, and we've seen that we can see a conclusion on the bony structure of the head and neck anatomy. So from here we say thanks for kind attention. Don't forget to like and subscribe for Science Dream Makers. Thank you.